I was still listening to Robert's voicemail through the car speakers when I pulled into the driveway. He sounded relaxed, almost cheerful, telling me he'd handled the pharmacy run and that I shouldn't worry about the guest room linens, because Amy was just staying put until the inspector cleared her old place. He'd used the word temporary twice in 40 seconds, but the way he said it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. I stepped out into the Houston humidity, the air thick enough to feel on my skin, and walked toward the front door. I had a folder of closing documents under my arm that I needed to review before tomorrow, and I was already thinking about the precise order of the signatures. The disturbance started in the hallway. I stopped short, my shoulder hitting the wall. Amy's heavy oak dresser, the one that had been sitting in a climate-controlled unit since the transition started, was now jammed into the narrow passage between the guest room and the linen closet. It wasn't just placed there. It was positioned with a level of permanence, its drawers already slightly ajar, a lace doily draped over the top. "Robert?" I called out. He came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me, then at the dresser, then back to me. He didn't move to shift it. "The movers came by while you were at the office," he said. "I thought we were waiting for the inspection report," I said. "You said the dresser stays in storage until we know the old house is sellable." They had a gap in their schedule. It was cheaper to just bring it now. That doesn't make sense. If the inspector finds a foundation issue, she's going back there to oversee the repairs. Why bring the heavy furniture now? Robert shrugged. He said he'd try for Tuesday. He's a busy guy, Sarah. I felt a sharp pull of irritation. I was certain he was lying about the inspector. I figured the report had already come back negative. Maybe a cracked slab or outdated wiring, and Robert was just shielding me from the stress of a failed sale. He always did that, fixing the immediate mood instead of the actual problem. Did he actually confirm Tuesday, or is he just trying? I asked. "He's trying," Robert said, his voice flattening. "It's fine. It's just a dresser." I walked past him into the living room. On the side table, the morning mail had been neatly sorted into small, precise piles. Bills, catalogs, and personal letters. Amy had done it. She always handled the mail, without being asked, a small, quiet efficiency that usually made me feel guilty for my frustration. I looked back at the dresser blocking the hallway, then at Robert, who was already heading back toward the kitchen. "I'll call the inspector's office tomorrow," I said. "Don't bother," Robert replied without turning around. "I'll just check in with him." He left the room, leaving me standing in the silence of the hallway, staring at the lace doily. I remembered a conversation from Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Robert ate a plate of leftover brisket. I had asked him if he'd heard from the inspector about the foundation of Amy's place. He'd paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and said that the guy was just running behind. At the time, I'd read that pause as a confession. I was certain the report had already landed in his inbox, and that it was a disaster, maybe a sunken slab or a cracked pier that would cost $20,000 to fix. I'd spent the next 3 days convinced that we were now the default long-term solution, because the house was effectively a ruin. I had built a whole narrative around Robert's silence, imagining him staring at a PDF of structural failures and deciding it was easier to let his mother move in than to tell me the truth. "You're doing that thing," Robert had said that night, noticing me staring at him. "What thing?" "The closing coordinator thing. You're auditing the conversation." I hadn't pushed it then. I'd just gone back to my laptop, thinking I was being the patient one, the one who could handle the bad news once he finally found the words to say it. I thought I was the only one seeing the disaster coming. But as I stood in the hallway now, looking at the dresser, I realized I had probably overread the silence. Robert wasn't hiding a failed inspection. He was just avoiding the effort of a schedule. He didn't care if the inspector was late, or if the house was falling down, as long as the immediate pressure of his mother's anxiety was gone. He hadn't been protecting me from a financial catastrophe. He had just been taking the path of least resistance. It didn't actually matter if the report was good or bad. The result was the same. I walked into the kitchen. Robert was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He'd already taken the trash out and swept the porch. Things he did every single evening, without a word, a rhythmic competence that usually kept me from questioning the other gaps in his management. He was good at the physical maintenance of our life, the parts that required a broom or a lawnmower. I just don't understand why you told her she could move the furniture in now, I said. I didn't tell her to move it all, he said, not looking up. I just told her it was fine if she wanted to start bringing things over. She was stressed about the storage unit fees. The storage unit is paid through the end of the month. She doesn't know that. She just knows she's in limbo. So you decided the hallway was the right place for a mahogany dresser? Robert finally looked at me. He didn't look guilty. He looked tired. It's just a piece of furniture, Sarah. We can move it if it's really in the way. I'll do it tomorrow. He didn't offer to do it now. He didn't ask if it bothered me. He just scheduled the fix for a vague future, the same way he'd handled the inspector. I looked toward the living room, where the mail was still sitting in those neat, precise piles. Amy had already claimed the administrative space of the house. She had found the one gap in our routine, the morning mail, and filled it so completely that it felt like an intrusion to move the papers. I didn't argue. I just went to the guest room and closed the door, leaving the dresser blocking the path to the linens. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the folder of closing documents open on my lap. I tried to focus on the title commitments, but the room felt smaller than it had a week ago. Amy had already placed a small crystal vase of carnations on the nightstand and a stack of folded hand towels on the chair. It wasn't a takeover, not exactly, but it was a layering. She was adding her preferences over mine, one small object at a time, and because the objects were pleasant, I felt like a villain for noticing them. I spent an hour crossing off items on my checklist, the air conditioner humming a low, steady vibration that usually helped me think. I kept thinking about the foundation of her house. I had spent days imagining a structural nightmare, a financial pit that would swallow Robert's savings. Now that I realized he was probably just avoiding a phone call, the anxiety didn't actually go away. It just shifted. The problem wasn't a cracked slab in another zip code. The problem was the dresser in my hallway. A soft knock sounded at the door. Amy leaned in, her face neutral, holding a small plate of sliced apples and a bowl of almonds. "I thought you might be hungry," she said. "You've been in here a while." "I'm okay, Amy. Thank you." She didn't leave immediately. She looked past me at the folder on my lap. "Robert said you were busy with the closings. He mentioned the one on Maple Street was giving you trouble." I paused, my pen hovering over a line of text. I didn't tell Robert about the Maple Street file. Amy blinked, her expression remaining pleasant. "Did he? He must have just assumed. He's always worrying about your workload." She set the plate on the edge of the nightstand, right next to the carnations, and stepped back. "I'll leave you to it." As she closed the door, I felt a flicker of the old irritation. It wasn't that she was spying. It was that she and Robert had developed a shorthand about my life that didn't include me. They were discussing my stress levels and my files in the kitchen while I was in the other room, or at the office, or in the car. I had been so focused on the possibility of a hidden debt or a ruined house that I'd missed the way they were simply coordinating around me. I walked out into the hallway. The dresser was still there, a heavy, mahogany sentinel blocking the path to the linens. I reached out and touched the lace doily. It was handmade, probably something she'd spent months on years ago. I didn't want to move it, but I also didn't want to have to shimmy past it every time I needed a fresh towel. In the kitchen, the smell of garlic and butter filled the air. Robert had already started dinner. He had a system for the Tuesday night meal, shrimp scampi with a side of sautéed spinach, and he executed it with a precision that I often lacked when I was stressed. He didn't ask for help, and he didn't need any. He moved through the kitchen with a quiet, rhythmic competence, chopping the parsley and skimming the butter, without a single wasted motion. "Dinner's almost ready," he said, not looking up from the pan. "Amy said you were working hard." "She mentioned the Maple Street file," I said. Robert paused, the spatula midair. "I just guessed. You always get that look in your eyes when the Maple Street people start arguing over the escrow." "I don't have a look." "You do," he said, and he actually smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that made me feel foolish for being on guard. He plated the food and set it on the table, the napkins perfectly aligned. He had handled the meal, the trash, the porch, and the pharmacy run. He was doing everything right, except for the one thing that actually mattered. He was treating the dresser in the hallway as a temporary inconvenience, while I could see it as a boundary marker. I sat down to eat, the food tasting exactly as it should, but I couldn't stop thinking about the guest room. I had retreated there to work, but I was a guest in my own space. "I'm going to move that dresser tomorrow," Robert said between bites. "You said that yesterday," I replied. He didn't answer. He just reached for the salt. I woke up Wednesday morning to the sound of the air conditioner struggling against the humidity and the distant, muffled tone of Amy's voice coming from the kitchen. I didn't get out of bed immediately. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the dresser. I had spent the night convinced that Robert's failure to move, it was a test of my patience, or perhaps a silent agreement he'd reached with his mother. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Amy was on the phone, her voice low and authoritative. She was leaning against the counter, her finger tracing the edge of a coaster. I couldn't make out the words, but she sounded decisive, the way she used to sound when she managed the family's holiday schedules 30 years ago. She looked up and saw me, but she didn't hang up. She just gave me a tight, polite smile and turned her shoulder, continuing the conversation in a hushed tone. I went to the coffee maker, my mind already racing. I was certain she was on the phone with the inspector, or perhaps a lawyer, coordinating some kind of delay that Robert hadn't told me about. I imagined her negotiating a timeline that stretched into the next year, using Robert as her silent proxy. I felt that familiar surge of adrenaline. The feeling that if I just pushed hard enough, I would find the document or the phone call that proved the temporary arrangement was a lie. "Who was that?" I asked as soon as she clicked the phone shut. Amy looked at me, her expression open. "Oh, just Martha. She's having a crisis with her hydrangeas. The soil in her new place is too alkaline, and she's convinced she's going to lose the whole bed." I paused, the coffee dripping slowly into the pot. "Martha? My sister," Amy said as if I had forgotten. "She's always been a bit dramatic about her gardening." I felt a hot flash of embarrassment. I had spent the last 5 minutes building a case for a conspiracy, imagining a secret legal maneuver to keep her in my guest room. And it was just a conversation about dirt. I had overread the tone of her voice, mistaking a sisterly critique of gardening for a strategic takeover of my home. I wanted to apologize, but the words felt too heavy, so I just turned toward the counter. "Robert," I called out. He was already dressed for work, pulling on his boots by the door. "Did you move the dresser?" "I'm heading out, Sarah," he said, not looking up. "I'll get to it this evening. I've got a crew at the Heights project starting at 7. "You said that yesterday." "I know when I said it," he replied. His voice wasn't angry, just flat. He stood up and grabbed his keys, the heavy jingle echoing in the hallway. I followed him to the door. "It's not just about the furniture, Robert. It's about the fact that you keep saying you'll handle it, and then you don't. It makes me feel like I'm the only one who cares that our house is being rearranged without a plan." Robert paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he was going to actually argue, to tell me I was being controlling or that I was overreacting. Instead, he just sighed. "It's just a dresser, Sarah. It's not a project. I'll move it when I get home." He stepped out and closed the door behind him. I stood in the entryway, looking back toward the hallway. The dresser was still there, the lace doily perfectly centered, the mahogany dark and imposing. By then, I knew my mistake wasn't just about the phone call. I had been looking for a grand scheme, a ruined house, a secret debt, a legal battle, because a grand scheme was something I knew how to coordinate. I could handle a crisis. What I couldn't handle was this slow, quiet erosion where the boundary wasn't being broken, but simply ignored. I walked back into the kitchen. Amy was humming to herself, neatly wiping down the counter where she had leaned during her call. She had already cleared the crumbs from the toaster and aligned the spice jars. She was making herself useful in the only way she knew how, and in doing so, she was making my own routines feel like interruptions. I reached for a towel to dry my coffee mug, but the linen closet was still blocked. I had to shimmy sideways, pressing my shoulder against the wall to get past the dresser. As I did, I noticed a small, framed photograph of Robert's father resting on the top shelf of the dresser. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't move the photo. I just stood there in the hallway, holding my mug, listening to the sound of Amy humming in the kitchen. Robert came home at 6, smelling of diesel and cut grass. He walked straight past me into the kitchen, his boots thudding on the hardwood. He didn't look at the dresser in the hallway, which was still exactly where it had been since Tuesday afternoon. The photo of his father was still there too, staring back at me with a faded, grainy smile. "I'm exhausted," he said, leaning his forehead against the cool surface of the refrigerator. The crew at the Heights hit a water line, spent 3 hours digging out mud. "Did you move the dresser?" I asked. He didn't move his head. "I'll get to it, Sarah. I just need a shower." I didn't push him. I knew the pattern. If I pushed now, he would move the dresser 2 inches to the left and call it a victory. Or he would get angry and tell me I was obsessing over a piece of wood. I went to the living room and sat on the sofa, listening to the shower run. About 10 minutes later, Robert's phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter. He was still in the shower, the water drumming against the tile. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the caller ID said, "Gary, inspection." My heart did a small, sharp jump. This was it. This was the call that would either prove the house was a ruin or prove that Robert was just being lazy. I picked up the phone, not to answer it, but just to see if he'd missed a message. The call went to voicemail. I waited, my thumb hovering over the screen, and then I played the message. "Hey, Robert, It's Gary, the voice said, sounding distorted and distant. I got the report back on your mom's place. It's not as bad as we feared. No major slab failure, but those piers in the back are definitely shifting. I can get you a quote for the leveling. But with the current backlog, I'm looking at a start date in late October. It'll probably be a 2-month process if we want to do it right before the winter rains hit. Give me a call back when you can. I set the phone back on the counter, the silence of the house suddenly feeling heavy. The house wasn't a ruin. There was no $20,000 catastrophe. It was just a standard foundation repair, the kind of thing that happened to half the houses in Houston. But the timeline, late October, a 2-month process, that was the real discovery. Robert had known this, or at least he'd known the likelihood of a delay. He hadn't been hiding a disaster. He had been managing a schedule. He had simply decided that temporary meant until the rain stops, and he had made that decision without telling me. When Robert came back into the kitchen, damp-haired and wearing a t-shirt, he saw the phone. He didn't ask if I'd heard the message. He just picked it up and slid it into his pocket. Gary called, I said. Yeah, Robert replied. He started filling a glass of water. He's backed up. Typical. He said October. He said it would take 2 months. Robert took a slow sip of water and looked at me. It's just a few more weeks. Sarah, it's better to do it right than to rush it and have the walls crack. You told me she was just staying put until the inspection cleared. You didn't say she was staying through November. I didn't know for sure until now, he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. Why are you making this a thing? She's not hurting anyone. She's helping with the mail. She's keeping the place clean. I'm making it a thing because the dresser is still in my hallway. Robert. He sighed, a long, exhausted sound that made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. I'll move it tomorrow. I promise. Just let it go for tonight. He walked away, heading toward the living room to turn on the news. I stayed in the kitchen, looking at the spot where the phone had been. I realized that the ruin I had imagined was actually easier to deal with than the truth. A ruin was a fact. A schedule was a choice. I walked back into the hallway and looked at the dresser. I didn't touch the doily this time. I just stood there, shimmying my shoulder against the wall to get to the linen closet, and took a single, thin hand towel from the shelf. I walked back into the kitchen and began to dry the dishes, one by one, in total silence. Thursday morning didn't bring the movement of the dresser. It didn't even bring a conversation about it. Robert left for the job site at 6, and the house settled into that quiet, humming tension that usually precedes a blowout. I spent my morning at the kitchen table with a stack of title commitments, trying to ignore the way Amy moved around me. She didn't hover, but she was always there, drifting in to refill the water pitcher or to wipe a stray crumb off the table while I was still eating. Around 10, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery driver with a large, flat box. I opened the door and took it, noticing the return address was a furniture store in San Antonio. Is this for you? I asked, looking at the label. Oh, that's for me, Amy said, appearing behind me. She didn't reach for the box immediately. She just looked at it with a small, satisfied smile. It's just a few things for the room, a new lamp and some organizers. The light in the guest room is a bit dim for reading. I looked at the box, then at the dresser still blocking the hallway. Amy, we talked about this being temporary. We aren't furnishing the room. It's just a lamp, Sarah, she said softly. I can't see my knitting in the evenings. I didn't move the box inside. I left it on the porch and went back to my papers. I felt that familiar, sharp pull of irritation, but it was dampened by a sense of exhaustion. I had spent so much energy imagining a structural catastrophe that I didn't know how to fight a lamp. When Robert came home that evening, he was in a mood. He'd lost a crew member to a family emergency and was behind on the Heights project. He walked into the kitchen and headed straight for the beer in the fridge, not acknowledging the box I'd left on the porch. "Your mother is ordering furniture," I said. Robert paused, the bottle halfway to his lips. "What furniture?" "A lamp, organizers, things to make the guest room more permanent." "It's a lamp, Sarah, for God's sake." "It's not the lamp, Robert. It's the fact that she thinks she's settling in." "Did you tell her she could stay through November?" Because Gary's voicemail sounded pretty definitive about the timeline. Robert leaned back against the counter, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look at me. I didn't give her a date. I just told her not to worry about the storage unit. "That's the same thing," I said. "If she isn't paying for storage, she's staying here." "Did you tell her it was okay to move the rest of her things in?" "I told her we'd figure it out," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't want her panicking while I was trying to manage a crew. I told her it was fine." "Fine for how long?" "I don't know. Until it's fixed." I stared at him. He wasn't lying. Not exactly. He had just used the word fine as a shield to stop a conversation he didn't want to have. He had granted her a vague, open-ended permission that she had interpreted as a permanent invitation. Robert said the house needed a bit of work. Amy called out from the living room. She had come in quietly, as she always did. I told Martha I'd likely be here through the season. It seemed the most practical thing. I looked from Robert to Amy. They weren't conspiring in a dark room. They were just collaborating in the gaps of my knowledge. Robert provided the vague permission, and Amy filled it with practical arrangements. They had built a version of the next 3 months that didn't require my input, and they had done it while being perfectly polite. "The season isn't a timeline," I said, though my voice sounded thin even to me. "It's just a few months, Sarah," Robert said. He took a drink of his beer and started to walk toward the stairs. "I'll move the dresser tomorrow. I promise." He didn't look back. He didn't ask if I was okay with the season. He just retreated to the shower, leaving me in the kitchen with Amy. She stood there for a moment, her expression neutral. Then, she reached over and straightened the stack of mail I had left on the counter. She did it with a quick, efficient motion, aligning the edges of the envelopes perfectly. "I'll put the lamp together tomorrow," she said. "It shouldn't take long." She turned and walked back toward the living room, leaving me alone with the silence and the knowledge that the dresser in the hallway was no longer a mistake. It was a marker. I walked to the porch and pushed the box inside, sliding it carefully past the doorframe and leaving it in the entryway, right where Robert would have to step over it to get to the stairs. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness. I woke up and immediately looked toward the bedroom door, half expecting the dresser to have vanished in the night, a silent peace offering from Robert. But when I walked into the hallway, the mahogany beast was still there, the lace doily undisturbed. The box from San Antonio was gone. Robert must have moved it into the guest room before I woke up, but he hadn't touched the dresser. He had solved the immediate obstacle in the entryway while leaving the larger one in the hallway. I spent the morning in the kitchen, my laptop open, trying to finalize the Maple Street escrow. I was on edge, my mind looping through the season comment. I kept waiting for another sign of a conspiracy, some hidden document, or a hushed phone call that would prove Robert had signed a lease or a care agreement I didn't know about. I wanted a smoking gun, because a smoking gun was something I could file and process. Around noon, the landline rang. I ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer, but it rang 3 times. Amy answered it. "Yes, this is Amy Bates," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "No, I have the account number right here." The notice said the easement survey was incomplete because the technician couldn't access the rear fence. "I can be there tomorrow at 10. "Yes, that works. Thank you." She hung up and looked at me. "The city was calling about that drainage notice you got last month. They needed a signature and access to the back lot. I told them I'd handle it." I stared at her. I had been dreading that call for 3 weeks. The city of Houston's drainage department was a bureaucratic nightmare, and I had a folder of their conflicting notices sitting on my desk, waiting for a window of time when I felt mentally strong enough to fight with a clerk. Amy had just handled it in 40 seconds. "I had that on my list," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I know, dear. I saw the envelope on the counter. It seemed like a simple fix, so I just took care of it." She smiled, a small, helpful expression that made me feel an unfamiliar kind of displacement. I was the coordinator. I was the one who tracked the deadlines, managed the paperwork, and pushed the stubborn parties toward a closing. But in my own kitchen, Amy was performing my job better than I was, and she was doing it with a grace that made my frustration look like petulance. By then, I knew I had been looking for the wrong kind of betrayal. I had been searching for a lie, a ruined house, or a secret contract, because I thought the harm was in the deception. But the real harm was the displacement. Amy wasn't stealing my house. She was stealing my function. She was filling the gaps I left behind, and Robert was happily stepping aside to let her do it. When Robert came home that evening, he didn't mention the dresser. He didn't mention the box. He just walked into the kitchen and started prepping a salad, his movements rhythmic and efficient. "Amy handled the drainage call," I told him. "That's great," he said, not looking up. "Saves you the headache." "It's not about the headache, Robert. It's about the fact that we are living in a house where the rules are being rewritten in the margins. Your mother is scheduling appointments for this property. She's ordering furniture. She's planning her stay through November." Robert stopped chopping. He looked at me, and for the first time all week, he looked genuinely annoyed. "Why can't you just be happy that things are getting done?" "I'm tired, Sarah. I'm tired of the auditing. She's helping. I'm helping. Just let it be." He didn't say he'd move the dresser. He didn't offer a date. He just turned back to the lettuce. The conversation closed. I walked into the hallway and stood in front of the dresser. I reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany, trying to shove it, but it didn't budge an inch. It was too heavy for me to move alone. I stood there, breathing hard, my shoulder pressed against the cold wood, listening to the sound of my husband and mother-in-law talking quietly in the kitchen about what to have for dessert. I let go of the dresser and walked back into the kitchen. I didn't say a word. I just picked up the city notice from the counter and tore it into 4 neat pieces. I stopped arguing about the dresser on Saturday. I realized that by fighting it, I was still playing the role of the coordinator, trying to manage a project that Robert had already decided to ignore. If I kept auditing the hallway, I was just providing the friction that allowed him to feel like the easygoing one. I spent the next few weeks in a state of quiet withdrawal. I didn't complain when Amy rearranged the spice rack, or when she started taking the morning mail into the guest room to sort it. I stopped checking the status of the foundation repairs. When Amy would ask me if I thought a certain shade of beige would look better for her living room curtains, I didn't offer my opinion on the lighting or the property value. I just said, "I'm sure Robert has a thought on that," and walked away. It was a strange, hollow feeling, but it was the only way to stop the displacement. I stopped being the buffer. The shift happened in mid-October. Amy had a question about the final utility shutoff for her old house, something that would usually have landed on my desk as a quick favor to make sure the paperwork was handled correctly. She found me in the kitchen and started to explain the notice she'd received. "I'm not sure if the water should be turned off on the 1st or the 15th, she said, holding the letter. "Ask Robert," I said. I didn't look up from my coffee. "Well, I thought you might know the process, since you do the closings," she replied. "Robert is handling the timeline for the house," I said. "He's the one talking to Gary. He'll know." I saw the confusion on her face, the sudden realization that the administrative safety net I usually provided had been pulled back. For the first time, she had to go to the person who had actually made the promises. Robert didn't like it. He hated being the one to deliver the no or the not yet. He spent a week glancing at me with a mix of resentment and bewilderment, wondering why I wasn't just fixing the things he was too lazy to coordinate. He tried to pull me back in once, asking if I could just quickly check a date on a moving contract. But I told him I had a deadline for a closing in Katy and didn't have the bandwidth. He didn't apologize for the bypass. He didn't acknowledge that he'd spent 2 months treating my home like a staging area for his mother's convenience. He just complained that I was being difficult and that the house felt tense. But because he was now the only point of contact, the pressure of the season finally landed on him. He couldn't avoid the schedule when he was the only one managing it. He had to be the one to tell his mother that the piers were taking longer than expected, and he had to be the one to figure out where the dresser actually belonged. On November 12th, the movers came back. I didn't help them carry the boxes. I didn't coordinate the truck's arrival or check the inventory list. I stayed in my office with the door closed, listening to the heavy thud of the mahogany dresser being hauled back out the front door and into the humidity. When the house finally went quiet, I walked into the guest room. The carnations were gone. The lamp was gone. The room was empty, the air smelling faintly of the lavender sachets Amy had tucked into the drawers. Robert came in behind me, leaning against the doorframe. "She's all set," he said. "The new place is ready for her." "Good," I said. "You still mad?" he asked. I looked at the empty space where the dresser had been, then back at him. I didn't tell him I was mad, and I didn't tell him it was okay. I just walked past him and closed the guest room door.